All right. Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to Accuracy in America. I'm Don Irvine, joined once again by my guest, Cheryl Chumley, the online opinion editor of the Washington Times. Good afternoon, Cheryl.
Hey, it's great to be back with you, Don.
All right. Got a few topics I want to kind of get your opinions and thoughts on. We'll start off, I guess, with let's start off with Liz Cheney. It's definitely a hot news item that's going on out there. So there's a lot of stuff going on there in terms of Kevin McCarthy, the minority leader. Looks like they want to oust Liz Cheney. She survived one of these these leadership challenges before, but he was caught on a hot mic disparaging her a little bit. And then I see that Steve Scalise has come out and is already promoting Elise Stefanik as a replacement. So, what's your take on this? I mean, the media to me right now, I mean, they're really very focused on this because they love the fighting in the GOP because they think that's going to take their eye off the ball towards 2022.
Right, which actually it does. I mean, they have a point. Just as Republicans point to Democrats when they have infighting, which isn't as frequent as the Republicans, it seems. But when it does happen, the Republicans like it too because it tears the factions apart. But look, the whole thing with Liz Cheney, and I posted on the Washington Times my full opinion on this matter. But Liz Cheney, to me, is part of the entrenched elite, right? She scores decent in the conservative tracking sites, GovTrack, in terms of votes, in terms of where she stands on actual votes. But as a party leader, she has been a distraction with her little spat with President Donald Trump. And that is a huge misstep in this day and age because the Republican Party of today is not the same as the Republican Party of a decade ago. The voices of the Tea Party types, the voices of the populists within the Republican Party, the voices that the elitists on Capitol Hill in the Republican Party have dismissed for years, we got a voice under President Trump, and we're not really willing to go back to being silent in the corner. So Cheney is making a serious misstep if she doesn't recognize the loud and strong voices still of the Trump faction. And I think that's what McCarthy was sort of referring to when he had that hot mic moment. He was talking about that she's become a little bit of a distraction from a more cohesive Republican message, which the party has been trying to do since Donald Trump has left office.
Yeah, I mean, with Republican leadership and everything like that, you would want to think that you want to have this kind of cohesiveness. I mean, you want to be able to kind of march forward, move forward. They've got the 2022 elections within their sights. They're looking like they're going to do pretty well. They're set up to retake the House, I think, with all of these things. And now you've got this person that's kind of just pecking away at you. She can't let go of the whole, her disdain for President Trump. Now she's entitled to her own opinion, whatever that may be. But that doesn't mean that we have to agree with her or Republicans have to agree with her. If she gets, if the voters in her district want to, elect her, that's well and fine. But I don't quite understand why she feels that she has to keep doing this. Is this also kind of the whole thing of where you have in the Senate, you've got like the Lisa Murkowski, Susan Collins type of thing. I mean, who else is in the House? Is it Kinzinger from Illinois? I mean, these people who want to speak out and are kind of the opposition within the party. I don't see what the purpose is of going down this line unless it's also part of this, we're also to a certain extent Bush loyalists, and this is the party to us still is reminiscent of the Bush era and not of the Trump era.
Yeah, I actually think that's what it is. I think that a lot of these Republicans on Capitol Hill think Trump was sort of an anomaly, and now that he's gone, it's back to normal. It's back to wheeling and dealing with Democrats and doing things behind closed doors, supposedly for the benefit of the American people. But really what it benefits is, first off, the party, the Republican Party, and then second off, it more caters to a go along to get along attitude with Democrats on Capitol Hill. So you have this sort of political class that gets along, and then you have the rest of the American citizenry. And so I do think that there's sort of a bubble that surrounds some of these elitists in the Republican Party, where they talk amongst each other and they sort of support each other in their let's get back to business type of government attitude, but they forget that there are still voters. No matter how big their funding pots grow, they still have to meet the muster of the voters. And with Liz Cheney, her polls, I haven't looked at them recently, but I know a month ago her polls in her own state were dive bombing. So that to me is her bigger concern. And if she's not focusing on what her voters want, she's missing the mark.
So, at the beginning of this too, you mentioned about the infighting about, we kind of did a short comparison between Democrats and Republicans. And you're right. I mean, why is it that the Republicans, seem to have this greater pen or infighting than the Democrats? And does the media play a factor too in terms of elevating the fights within the GOP versus the Democratic Party?
First, to answer your second first, definitely the media, right? The media, which is far left water curious for the Democrat Party, they pounce on stuff like this, and they really, they probably drive it far out of proportion. So the infighting seems worse than it is. But here's my thought: why Democrats have more of a cohesive message and they seem to stand together. Republicans have been traditionally the party of principle and the party of ideas, right? And there has been room in the Republican Party for a variety of different ideas. We encourage debate among different people. We encourage, minorities to bring to the table their ideas. We encourage the youth to come in. We encourage women to come in, and we debate and discuss these ideas, and we try and bring them together as one. So, of course, you're going to have different ideas, different bickering, different types of looks at how this country should be governed in line with the Constitution still. The Democrats, their main goal is power, right? So no matter how different their opinions are, they will jump willingly in bed with their enemies so long as it gives them power. Look at the relationship between, say, Nancy Pelosi, right, and Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez. It used to be very friction-oriented, right? It was head-butting, and it was very public, the argument. Then Nancy Pelosi had that big behind closed doors meeting with Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, and then AOC ended up firing her chief of staff or whoever it was that came out publicly criticizing Pelosi. And since, those two have not engaged so much in public spats. Now, on paper, they should be different in platforms, right? Nancy Pelosi should be a Democrat. Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez should be a socialist. But they come together with their political ambitions, which ultimately is a power grab of individual rights in America.
Yeah, I mean, didn't Pelosi in her book, didn't she kind of take a shot at AOC a little bit? But it didn't seem to really elicit a lot of reaction. I mean, I think you're right. These two have they've kind of made peace in an odd way because they are trying to. They realize that they're better together from the power standpoint than they are if they're fighting against each other. I need to tell you this one thing too on just how different the Republicans can be. Years ago, I had a meeting with then Congressman Lamar Smith from Texas, and he had a big interest in accuracy in media and things like that. And he was a former reporter down in San Antonio, and so he really liked he loved everything about fighting against media bias. And he told me that he was trying to form this media fairness caucus, and that he had a hard time, when Hastert and DeLay, I mean, one of his own, buddies from Texas, he had a hard time getting them to recognize anything like this. The things he wanted to do, he wanted to kind of get a bunch of other fellow Republicans and talk about media bias and things like that, because Congress is, especially Republican Congress, I mean, they get beat over the head. And, they set themselves up a lot for this too. And under Pelosi, he knew he wasn't going to get, diddly squat. But, I always thought it was interesting. I think he just threw that out at me, just saying, it's like, I can't even get sometimes my fellow Texan, a very high ranking guy, to go along with me on this. I mean, he wound up getting, I think, at least when I was speaking with him, he had about 13 to 15 House members there when they were in the minority. I assume that he grew that when they, afterwards a little bit. And they ran that, I think, until he finally retired. But, it's hard. I mean, but I think that goes back to this thing. I mean, they are principally, they're looking at different things. They are willing to accept a lot of different points of view. They don't necessarily agree, but they are not, the Republicans generally are not the power hungry like Democrats are. So I think that's a good summation of that.
Well, I think the big takeaway from this whole Liz Cheney leadership battle with Kevin McCarthy and now, like you said, Steve Scalise weighing in, I think really the big takeaway for the American people is that who on Capitol Hill represents the American citizen over the party, because that's the real problem here. We have too many politicians who say one thing to the citizens, to their constituents, and then they go to Capitol Hill and they become one of 435 or one of 100, and they're part of that club now. And it's all about promoting the interests and the power and the sustainability of the political party. And I understand the nature of political parties, right? You have to do party will in order to keep your strength going into the future, because it is about winning elections against Democrats in that respect. But at the same time, the American people, and rightly so, since we're paying these salaries, right, believe that those politicians are there in office to do the individual citizens' will. And so really, that's the big battle here. Who are politicians representing? And when you look at a public spat like taking place between Cheney and McCarthy and Scalise, we really have to sift through what's being reported in the media and decide, how is this representing my interest over that of the parties?
Right. All right. On to another media story. Rudy Giuliani. So about a week ago or so, I mean, there was, they were all, the media was all afloat. The liberals were all out there about this FBI raid on Giuliani's apartment. The deal, anything about Russian disinformation about on the campaign in 2016, and all of these things in 2020. All these things that were going on here, and then we come to find out that the Washington Post, New York Times, NBC News, they had to come out and they had to basically correct their story about this, that because they had said that Rudy Giuliani had received a briefing, had been warned by the FBI about all of this stuff, when in fact he had not. What is going on here?
Not just Rudy Giuliani, but One America News, right?
One America News, that's right.
Those leftist-leaning media outlets reported that Giuliani and One America News had been warned in 2019 that the Russians were trying to infiltrate their personal areas of influence to do Russian bidding and damage Joe Biden. And Giuliani said, I wasn't warned. One America News said, I wasn't warned. And it turns out the unidentified anonymous sources that were used by these left-leaning outlets, again, were wrong. And they were forced to retract. And this should be a very embarrassing retraction. But it didn't come until, I think, even CNN's I can't remember his name, Brian Stelter.
Brian Stelter, right.
That, condemnation of his comrades in arms in the press, and basically called them out for not retracting sooner. So the problem here is not just the left-leaning media is at it again, trying to attack those affiliated with or associated with Trump and friendly reporting on Trump, but it's also the problem of anonymous sources. I mean, I've been in this business for over 2 decades now, and it was a core principle in the early stages of my reporting career that anonymous sources were only to be used in the most extreme of circumstances. And usually you ended up having to at least whisper to your editor who the anonymous source was, just so they could go to print with some sort of sense of comfort that they were giving the public something that was actually based on a solid source. We have gotten away from that. Now it's just, and I don't know, probably part of the reason for getting away from that is that, the 24/7 news cycle, the online news, the social media where you just slap something up and it just becomes part of the ever steamrolling engine of the media. But really, the New York Times, if it wants to maintain any semblance of reputation, they ought to come out and name who their anonymous source was and basically put a moratorium on using anonymous sources except under the most extreme of circumstances, except when it is provably beneficial to the American people, to the readership. And only in those circumstances should they use anonymous sources now, because that's the biggest problem. We saw this under Donald Trump for 4 years, one anonymous source after another, alleging this, alleging that, all of which fell to the wayside.
Well, I mean, even that was it an anonymous op-ed piece on Trump? That they. Yeah. Right, but and that's a really good point here too. I mean, this is the thing that the media has really changed. As you said, in the time, just the time, really short time that you've been in this business compared to a lot of others, and in terms of how they deal with this, anonymous sources seem to almost, they don't have any problem using anonymous sources, and doing this, and yet time after time, the anonymous sources fail them. Right? I mean, Dean Baquet, it came out, so they should have done a more rigorous vetting of this. Well, duh. Hello. You're running this paper. You allowed this to happen. I mean, what is going on here with this? Stelter. The interesting thing about Stelter, I mean, it was great to see him call him out too. Of course, on that same segment, he had Oliver Darcy, who was trying to soften the blow against the liberal colleagues by looking at conservatives when things like this, and trying to also go to that end and say, well, they don't go and make the correct things and stuff like this, the conservative, and so he was creating kind of this other impression that this is, it's okay, this is, we can forgive them for this because they really didn't mean to do this. But Rudy Giuliani is like in a lot of ways, he's like Donald Trump. I mean, he is a lightning rod for criticism, for attention by the liberal press. And there isn't a lot that Rudy Giuliani can say that the media is going to agree with and they're going to like. So that, if they can jump on a story, if they can see, they would have no greater pleasure, I think, than seeing Rudy Giuliani being carted off to jail someday or prison, right? I think that would give them no end of joy for that. And so, if it takes using anonymous sources to disparage them and to try to do these things, they're going to do this. And then to bring One American News. I mean, it probably elevated One American News. I mean, I don't think a lot of people necessarily pay a whole lot of attention, but all of a sudden you're like, I think some people are probably like, who the heck are they? But once I mean, NBC News, I mean, they, I guess in their correction, they said a briefing was prepared, but was not delivered, and so, they had to do this. It's like, well, how hard was this to figure out? Right? Could you not have found, the real truth of this? You would have avoided all this problem. But, even though they corrected it, for me, this is what I found in all the time I've been around. It's just that the corrections, they don't come, they're not enough of them to begin with. But when they come, it's okay. But the damage has already been done with that first initial story, because I always feel that the story about, Giuliani being given the briefing and having his apartment raided, that's what resonates and will stay in the mind of people first and foremost. The correction is out there on the record. Thank you, Brian Stelter, for giving it, at least to your audience, even though it's probably not a very large audience. That's a step in the right direction. But I think that if we took a room full of people about this, they'll remember the first story and not the correction.
Well, yeah, and the social media giants will make sure that happens as well, because it'll be all over the Twitter world about Giuliani. But the correction it's a much softer story. It just doesn't sell as well. And, there's another aspect of this as well, that this is very lazy journalism. I think most journalists get at some point in their career some anonymous tips. But the idea is to take those tips and to try and prove them somehow before you go to print. You take anonymous information and then you seek out those who can confirm it on the record, or you seek out documents that go towards supporting what the anonymous source told you. You don't just take the anonymous source and run with it and blast the headline as if the anonymous source is telling you something truthful. Because to me, an anonymous source is always suspicious. My number one question is, why can't you go on record with it? What is it that prevents you from going on record? And I know in politics, everything's high stakes on Capitol Hill, especially when you're dealing with the White House. But that doesn't take away from the fact that most of the times when an anonymous source comes to a journalist with something, there is some hard work that you can do, some digging that can be done to at least offer up some supporting evidence of what the anonymous source is saying. Instead of just flying with it, letting it run all over social media, all over TV for 24 hours, and then in the dead of night issuing some sort of 10th paragraph correction with apology.
Yeah, I mean that's the thing too, and even though the newspapers are trying to say now, or at least when people were reading newspapers, they started running corrections of things, all kinds of stuff. So a lot of it was even minor, stuff that they were doing, that they were putting out there. But a lot of times corrections wind up even in a newspaper where they would wind up getting buried somewhere, in a place where people generally weren't going to be looking,
Right.
rather than readdressing the story, and saying, a bigger headline saying correction, here's what we did or whatever. We saw this with 60 Minutes when when AIM was doing a lot against them and stuff like that. It's amazing what they will do to downplay that, and the damage will have been done. All right, another thing I want to talk to you about is that the Department of Education has proposed some rules about some curriculum, and it's in the Federal Register, in particular focusing in on critical race theory in American history and civics classes. And there's the comment period is, I think, expires on May 19th or thereabouts, and what. But here it is. Here we have, Biden's education department now with this going out there and saying, okay, we think we should be teaching this critical race theory in our schools. And I don't necessarily know how they stop it, except for we're seeing states that are trying to already ban it. But I mean, is this yet another step towards the leftist socialist march we've been seeing?
Oh, absolutely. And actually, this is the topic of my column that'll be in the Washington Times tomorrow, about the devastations that critical race theory taught to our youngest, most impressionable minds in America will wreak on the future of U.S. freedoms. If you have a worldview where everything circles back to race, and the assumption is that a system is inherently racist, that is going to taint your entire look at everything from the justice system to the economic system to the very constructs of the government and the political system. So this is where the left is leading with critical race theory. It's not just an idea that they want bandied about in public schools in U.S. history and civics classes, along with, the classics of the founding fathers and the limited government aspects of the Constitution. This is something that they want ingrained in our youth. So we have the next generation of American leaders, and more to Democrat truth, American sheep, who believe that America was founded on ideals that were rooted in racism. Because founding fathers owned slaves, then anything that came out of the founding fathers' mouths or anything that they penned was automatically racist. And that includes the Constitution and our very form of government. And so once they instill that in the next generation of America's leaders and the next generation of America's followers, where does that leave America and the whole concept that we have in this country of rights coming from God, not government? It just completely turns that cart over. And in a way, critical race theory is very secular as well, because instead of focusing on the idea that we're all born in God's eyes equal, instilled at birth with certain talents that our Constitution and our Declaration of Independence gives us a right and an avenue to pursue and exploit for our own successes and ambitions, it turns everything into a victimhood type thing, where certain classes of society based on the color of their skin have succeeded because of the color of their skin, whereas versus certain classes of society because of the color of their skin have failed or not achieved as well as others because of the color of their skin. So that whole concept of God-given rights based on God-given talents is eradicated. And that is the foundation of America's exceptionalism.
Yeah, I mean, this is really disturbing. I mean, you know, my kids, and I guess your kids are all grown too, right?
Two of them. I still have one in college and one 14. So
okay, you still got the 14. All right. So you're still a parent of someone who could be potentially subjected to this. Then, you know, and in essence, you know, my kids are older, and that. But this worries me about my grandchildren. These types of things about what is going on here, and you know, the left. I mean, this is for them. It's a smart thing. I mean, their indoctrination of the youth, you know, fits right into what they want to do. You know, you take these young, impressionable minds and you throw out this critical race theory, and then you turn these people into these social justice warriors, et cetera, as they get older. I mean, you know, I can go back to when Accuracy in Academia was founded, you know, 36 years ago now, you know, and when we were concerned then about was this and free speech issues and on college campuses, but also some of the courses being taught. But I remember being at a conference where, you know, somebody was saying, oh, look, it's not just the high schools, you know, colleges, you got to go to high school, you know, and now we're looking at middle school and even elementary school. You start looking back and you start saying, if you start looking at what is being taught by a lot of these teachers, but, you know, things like this, it can be pretty shocking. And so this is yet another piece of that puzzle, or whatever you want to call it, that goes into, that says, okay, let's fit this into this. Years ago, you know, the Gay, Lesbian, Straight Education Network, they were pretty effective in this. They did a film called It's Elementary. And, you know, the premise of the film was that basically you're saying it's okay to be gay, you know, to be dealing with this, and this was targeted at elementary school kids. Okay, like they knew about their sexuality at the age of 5, 6, 7, or 8. And they actually had this whole thing was unbelievable, but it was also that indoctrination that, you know, if they start getting into these young minds about, you know, kind of confusing them and things like that, they start capturing those people into their movements to be whatever they're going to be at 18, 19, 20, whatever, go throughout the rest of their lives. This is just something that, you know, we've got to find a way to stop this. I don't know how to necessarily stop it, but, you know, unbelievable about where we're going to, and plus, you know, and we have the critical race theory, and then we've got the 1619 project, which is, you know, is garbage, but that also looks like it's going to make its way in.
Yeah, and they're tying it to funding, and this is what the Barack Obama administration did, if you recall, with the transgender policies in school. Going through the Department of Education to issue guidance, so-called, where schools were encouraged to open the bathrooms to both sexes, open the dressing rooms to both sexes. So you had girls afraid to go into the bathroom because they thought that boys might be in there next to them. It was never a law that was passed through Congress. It was just simply Barack Obama's will being exerted on the American public school system through his Department of Education. And now you have Joe Biden, in essence, doing the same thing through his Department of Education. And of course, they're not coming out and even calling it critical race theory or calling it the 1619 Project. They're using all their clever coding of language, but it's in essence, essentially, the same sort of teaching that the critical race theory and 1619 Project project people want brought into the minds of American youth. And the fact that it's tied to funding is the real danger here, because I can't think of very many public school systems run as they are by leftists and infiltrated by Democratic Socialists of America, even as they are. I can't think of too many public schools in America that will turn down this funding. So what we're going to have, by and large, in the coming year, in the coming semesters, when all the kids come back to school, they're going to be treated to these special segments, these special courses of teaching that are going to show why America is no different from any other nation in the world. And in fact, in many examples, is worse because it's so tied to racism. And so this thing will be getting its wings very quickly because of the funding ties that it has.
Yeah, looks like the basic alternative here really is homeschooling and parochial type schooling, in essence, to get their kids away from this. But the parents need to hopefully we can learn about this. Hopefully your column will stir some things too, because if the parents aren't paying attention to this, their kids, this is going to be a real tragedy for our nation's youth. All right.
Yes.
We've reached the top of the hour, and I promise I don't want to keep you past that. So once again, thank you for joining me again today. Great discussion. We really appreciate all that you do. Everyone out there, please continue to check out Cheryl and her writing on the Washington Times website, her Bold and Blunt podcast, all the good work that Cheryl and the Washington Times are doing. They're holding the fort on conservative thought and opinion. So keep going. All right.
Trying to. Thanks so much, Don.
All right. Thank you for joining us, and we'll see you again next week.
All right.